Snow lashed against the frosted glass of Nora Caldwell's antique shop, masking the sound of sirens wailing in the distance. Blood dripped onto the floorboards, pooling beneath a man who had collapsed against her heavy oak door. Letting him in was a gamble of life and death, driven by a sliver of human desperation and pity. She thought she was saving a homeless vagrant from a brutal winter freeze. She had no idea that by sunrise, 300 heavily armored black SUVs would barricade her street, trapping her in a deadly war between two of the most ruthless syndicates in the city. The blizzard of December 2024 was one that the city of Boston would remember for decades. Temperatures plummeted to a record-breaking 10 degrees below zero, and the wind howled through the narrow, winding alleys of the North End like a wounded animal. Inside Caldwell Antiquities, Nora Caldwell wrapped her thick woolen cardigan tighter around her shoulders, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The building's ancient radiator had finally given up the ghost 3 days prior, and Nora, drowning in a sea of red-inked final notices from the National Grid and the property management firm of Sterling and Baines, simply did not have the funds to fix it. She was 28, entirely alone in the world after her grandfather's passing, and desperately trying to hold on to the only legacy he had left her. A shop filled with Victorian lockets, first-edition Hemingway novels, and tarnished silver pocket watches. It was nearly midnight. The city had enacted a strict curfew due to the whiteout conditions, and Hanover Street, usually bustling with late-night bakery patrons and tourists, was a desolate, frozen wasteland. Nora walked toward the front of the shop to switch off the vintage Tiffany lamp in the window. As her hand hovered over the brass switch, a heavy, wet thud struck the reinforced glass of the front door. She froze. The sound was wrong. Too heavy to be a branch blown by the wind, too deliberate to be debris. Thump! A smear of crimson appeared against the frosted pane, stark and terrifying against the white snow illuminated by the street lamp outside. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. Logic screamed at her to retreat to the back room, lock the deadbolt, and dial 911. The North End had gentrified, but the shadows of the old neighborhood's violent history still lingered in the cobblestones. Yet, as she stared at the glass, a trembling, gloved hand slid down the pane, leaving a streak of blood in its wake. Someone was dying out there. Swallowing her terror, Nora unlatched the deadbolt and yanked the heavy oak door inward. The wind immediately blasted into the shop, bringing with it a torrent of snow and a man who fell across the threshold like a felled tree. He was large, easily over 6 feet tall, and heavy with muscle. He wore a dark wool overcoat that was soaked through, though not entirely with melting snow. As Nora knelt beside him, the metallic copper scent of blood overwhelmed the crisp winter air. "Hey," Nora whispered, her voice trembling as she grabbed his shoulders, trying to haul him fully inside before the storm could claim them both. "Hey, can you hear me? I need to shut the door." A low groan escaped his lips. He shifted, his boots dragging across the hardwood floor, and somehow managed to push himself inward, just enough for Nora to slam the door shut and throw the deadbolt. The sudden silence inside the shop was deafening, broken only by the man's ragged, shallow breathing. Nora scrambled backward, her eyes darting over his form. Underneath the ruined, blood-soaked overcoat, he wore a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed wealth, a Brioni, perhaps, or something equally exclusive. A shattered Patek Philippe watch clung to his left wrist, but it was his face that caught her breath. He had sharp, aristocratic features, a strong jaw shadowed by dark stubble, and pitch-black hair matted with sweat and snow. He looked like a fallen prince, dangerous and rugged. And then his coat fell open, revealing the polished steel grip of a heavy-duty Kimber 1911 pistol tucked into a shoulder holster. Nora gasped, scrambling away until her back hit the checkout counter. He wasn't a vagrant. He wasn't a lost businessman. The man's eyes slowly fluttered open. They were the color of shattered ice, a piercing, startling blue that seemed to analyze the room, the exits, and finally, her in a fraction of a second. His hand twitched toward his holster, a pure reflexive motion, before a spasm of pain racked his body and he coughed, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Don't call! The police!" he rasped. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, commanding even in his weakened state. "You're bleeding to death," Nora stated, trying to keep her panic in check. "You've been shot. I have to call an ambulance." "No hospitals." He gritted his teeth, his hand pressing against his lower right side, where the blood was thickest. "If they find me, we both die. Lock the door. Pull the shades." Nora stood frozen, her mind racing. This was how people disappeared. This was how innocent bystanders ended up as statistics in the morning paper. She should run out the back. She should leave him. But as she looked at him, shivering violently on the floorboards of her grandfather's shop, an irrational surge of protectiveness washed over her. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. "Silas," he breathed out, his eyes rolling back as unconsciousness threatened to pull him under again. "Just Silas." Nora didn't know that she had just invited Silas Rossi, the newly anointed head of the Rossi crime syndicate, into her home. She only knew that he was a shivering, bleeding stranger, and she could not let him die in the dark. Nora dragged Silas, agonizing inch by agonizing inch, to the back of the shop, where a small kitchenette and her cramped living quarters were separated from the retail space by a heavy velvet curtain. She managed to heave him onto an antique Chesterfield sofa, uncaring that his blood was staining the century-old tufted leather. She ran to the bathroom, grabbing the most comprehensive first aid kit she owned, a stack of clean towels, and a half-empty bottle of Grey Goose vodka she had received as a Christmas gift from a neighboring bakery owner, Mrs. Donatelli, 3 years ago. When she returned, Silas had managed to shrug off his ruined overcoat and suit jacket. He was attempting to unbutton his blood-soaked dress shirt, his fingers clumsy and shaking. "Stop, let me," Nora ordered, her voice surprisingly steady. The adrenaline had burned away her fear, leaving behind a cold, clinical focus. She battered his hands away, unbuttoning the shirt and pulling it back to reveal a torso carved from marble, marred by bruises, old scars, and a fresh, ragged bullet hole in his right side. "It was a through and through," Silas murmured, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to snap. "Missed the liver, I think. Just need to pack it and bind it." Nora poured the vodka directly over the wound. Silas didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. Only a sharp hiss of air escaped his teeth, and his hands gripped the leather armrests of the sofa, tightly enough to crack the aged wood beneath the upholstery. Nora marveled at his terrifying tolerance for pain. With shaking hands, she packed the wound with sterile gauze, her knuckles brushing against the taut, feverish skin of his abdomen. She wrapped a wide bandage around his waist, pulling it as tight as she could. Every time she leaned over him, she could feel his icy blue eyes fixed intently upon her face. He was studying her, memorizing her features. "Why did you open the door?" he asked suddenly. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the main shop and the relentless howling of the blizzard outside. "You were bleeding on my glass," Nora deflected, stepping back to wash her hands in the kitchenette sink. The water ran pink, then clear. Most people in this city would have stepped over a dying man to avoid getting their shoes dirty, Silas noted. his voice softer now, lacking the harsh edge of command. "You saw the gun, yet you dragged me in here." "I guess I'm a bad judge of character," Nora said softly. She moved to the stove and clicked the burner on, setting a kettle to boil. Or maybe I just didn't want the paperwork of a corpse in my shop. A ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips. It transformed his face entirely, softening the brutal lines of his jaw and making him look devastatingly handsome. "What is this place?" "Caldwell Antiquities. We sell things people have forgotten about." Nora brought over a mug of chamomile tea, setting it on the small end table beside the sofa. She pulled a thick quilt from her bed and draped it over him. He was still shivering, his body fighting off the shock and the cold. "You're struggling?" Silas observed. Nora bristled. "Excuse me?" He gestured vaguely with his chin toward a stack of papers on the kitchen counter, the final notices from the bank and the management firm. "I recognize the letterhead of Sterling and Baines. They're notorious vultures. They buy up properties in the North End, double the rent, and force the old blood out." "It's none of your business," Nora snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "They work for a man named Dante Corvo," Silas continued, ignoring her tone. His eyes darkened, a storm brewing in their depths. "Corvo is a parasite. He takes what he wants." "And what about you?" Nora asked, her gaze dropping to the Kimber 1911 sitting on the coffee table where Silas had placed it. "Are you a parasite, Silas?" The silence that stretched between them was heavy, pregnant with unsaid truths. Silas looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the fraying cuffs of her cardigan, the exhaustion in her amber eyes, and the fierce, defiant tilt of her chin. "No," Silas said quietly. "I am the monster that kills the parasites." Nora didn't know how to respond to that. She retreated to an armchair across the room, pulling her knees to her chest. For hours neither of them spoke. The shop grew colder as the night wore on, the storm showing no signs of stopping. Silas eventually drifted into a restless, feverish sleep, his brow furrowed in pain. Nora stayed awake, keeping watch. She watched his chest rise and fall, watched the shadows play across his face. She knew she had crossed a line tonight, stepping out of her quiet, failing life and into a dangerous current. She just didn't know how fast the water was moving. Around 4 a.m, a burner phone in Silas's discarded coat pocket buzzed. It didn't ring, just a single, harsh vibration. Silas woke instantly, his hand darting to the coffee table and wrapping around the grip of his pistol before his eyes were even fully open. Seeing Nora still in the armchair, he relaxed slightly. He reached into his coat and answered the phone, not putting it to his ear, but pressing it to his chest to muffle his voice. "Yeah," he whispered. A pause. "I'm alive. The North End. Hanover. It was Corvo's men. They ambushed the convoy." Another long pause. The voice on the other end was frantic. "Tinny." "Bring everyone," Silas commanded, his tone turning to absolute ice. "Lock down the grid. If Corvo breathes, I want him suffocated. If he runs, I want his legs broken. Be here by dawn." He hung up, dropping the phone onto the floor. He looked across the dim room at Nora, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. "I'm sorry," Silas said, his voice laced with genuine regret. "I brought my war to your doorstep, Nora." "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone who owes you his life," he replied. "And I always pay my debts." Nora must have fallen asleep in the armchair, because the next thing she knew, grey, muted daylight was filtering through the gaps in the heavy velvet curtains. The blizzard had broken, leaving a profound, suffocating silence in its wake. But it wasn't the silence that woke her. It was a vibration. It started low, a subsonic hum that resonated through the ancient floorboards of the shop, rattling the delicate porcelain teacups in their display cases and making the glass of the front windows tremble in their frames. It felt like an earthquake, but the rhythm was too steady, too mechanical. Nora sat up sharply, her joints aching from sleeping in the chair. She looked toward the Chesterfield sofa. It was empty. The bloody quilt was folded neatly over the armrest. Panic seized her throat. "Silas?" she called out softly. "I'm here." She turned. Silas was standing by the crack in the curtains that separated the back room from the storefront. He had managed to put his blood-stained shirt back on, though it hung open, and his coat was draped over his shoulders to hide the bandages. He looked paler than the night before, leaning heavily against the doorframe for support, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He was looking out the front window of the shop. "What is that noise?" Nora asked, moving cautiously toward him. The rumbling was growing louder, shaking the dust from the rafters. It sounded like an army of heavy machinery. "My ride," Silas said simply. Nora pushed past him and stepped into the storefront. She walked to the large display window, reached up, and pulled the cord to raise the heavy roller blinds. The breath was completely knocked from her lungs. Hanover Street, usually a picturesque avenue of brick sidewalks and quaint lampposts, had been transformed into a fortress. Nose to tail, blocking every inch of the street, the sidewalks and the intersections as far as the eye could see, was a fleet of identical, black, heavily armored SUVs. There were Escalades, Suburbans, and Mercedes G-Wagons, their engines idling in unison, creating the deep, vibrating roar that shook the shop. Nora pressed her hands against the freezing glass, her mind failing to process the sheer scale of what she was seeing. There weren't just a few cars. There were dozens, hundreds. They stretched down to the plaza and up toward the old church. 300 black cars, a sea of dark steel against the pristine white snow of the morning. Men were stepping out of the vehicles. They were dressed uniformly in tailored dark suits and heavy wool overcoats. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized discipline, fanning out to secure the perimeter. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human barricade around Caldwell Antiquities. Nora saw the unmistakable bulges of automatic weapons beneath their coats. Some carried matte black rifles openly, ignoring the few terrified residents peering out from the second-story apartments above the street. The city police were nowhere to be seen. The street had been entirely commandeered by a private army. "Silas?" Nora gasped, stepping back from the window, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She bumped into a display table, sending a silver tray clattering to the floor. "What is this? Who are these people?" Silas stepped up behind her. His presence was a solid, overwhelming force. He looked out at the street with cold satisfaction. "I told you I wasn't a vagrant, Nora," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. Out on the street, the doors of a massive, armored Cadillac Escalade parked directly in front of the shop swung open. A man stepped out. He was older, with silver hair, carrying himself with an air of absolute authority. He looked at the antique shop, gave a sharp nod, and began walking toward the front door. The sea of armed men parted for him instantly. "They're the Rossi Syndicate," Silas said, stepping away from the window and moving toward the front door. "And they're here for me." You're a Rossi?" Nora had lived in Boston her whole life. Even a civilian knew the name Rossi. They owned the ports, the unions, the real estate. They were untouchable, a dynasty built on blood and shadow, and she had just spent the night wiping blood off the heir to the empire. "I am the head of the family," Silas corrected, his hand resting on the brass handle of the front door. He turned back to look at her, his expression softening just a fraction. Last night, my uncle, allied with Dante Corvo, staged a coup. They slaughtered my security detail. I barely made it out. They thought I was dead in the snow. He unlocked the deadbolt. They were wrong. Silas pulled the heavy oak door open. The biting morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of exhaust fumes and impending violence. The silver-haired man reached the steps, immediately dropping to one knee in the snow, bowing his head. "Boss," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "We tore the city apart looking for you." "Get up, Carlo," Silas commanded. "Is Corvo found?" "We have his properties surrounded. He's trapped in the Sterling and Baines high-rise downtown." Silas nodded, a cruel, lethal smile playing on his lips. "Good." He turned back to Nora, who was standing paralyzed among the antique clocks and dusty books. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy platinum money clip holding a stack of black, metal cards. He tossed it onto the glass checkout counter. It landed with a heavy clack. "What is that?" Nora whispered. "Consider it payment for the medical services, the ruined sofa, and the tea," Silas said. "And consider your debts with Sterling and Baines permanently erased. Dante Corvo won't be collecting rent anymore. Not from anyone." Silas turned and walked out the door, descending the steps into the sea of armed men. Carlo flanked him immediately, throwing a thick cashmere coat over Silas's shoulders. Nora ran to the door, her heart pounding wildly. "Wait!" she yelled into the frigid air. Silas stopped, turning back to look at her from the street. 300 armed men stood in dead silence, their eyes fixed on the small woman in the doorway of the antique shop. "Are you coming back?" The words slipped out of her mouth before she could stop them, driven by an inexplicable pull toward the dangerous man who had bled on her floor. Silas Rossi stared at her for a long moment, the winter wind whipping his dark hair. "Lock your door, Nora Caldwell," he called out, his voice echoing over the rumbling engines. "When the war is over, I will come back for what's mine." He turned and climbed into the back of the armored Cadillac. The doors slammed shut with the finality of a vault. The lead cars began to move, a massive, mechanical beast awakening. Nora stood in the doorway, the cold biting at her skin, watching as the 300 black cars rolled slowly down Hanover Street, carrying the shivering stranger back to his throne, and leaving her world forever changed. The silence that descended upon Hanover Street after the armada of black SUVs departed was heavier than the blizzard itself. Nora stood in the doorway of Caldwell Antiquities for a long time, the freezing wind biting through her thin cardigan, her eyes fixed on the tire tracks carved deep into the morning snow. It looked as though a military division had rolled through the North End, leaving nothing but crushed ice and echoing quiet in its wake. Slowly, her numb fingers found the brass handle. She pulled the heavy oak door shut and threw the deadbolt, the metallic click sounding unnervingly loud in the empty shop. Her legs finally gave out. Nora slid down the back of the door, pulling her knees to her chest as the delayed shock set in. She had just harbored the head of the Rossi syndicate. She had poured cheap vodka into the gunshot wound of a man who commanded an army capable of locking down a major American city. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she forced herself to stand and walked over to the glass checkout counter. Silas's payment sat exactly where he had dropped it. It was a solid platinum money clip, incredibly heavy and engraved with a subtle, stylized R, surrounded by a wreath of laurel leaves. Clipped within it was a stack of crisp, perfectly uncirculated $100 bills, easily $10,000. But it was what lay beneath the cash that made Nora's breath catch. It was a J.P. Morgan Reserve credit card, the heavy brass and palladium kind that was rumored to be issued only by invitation to the world's ultra-wealthy. The name pressed into the metal read S. Rossi. Wrapped around the card was a piece of heavy, cream-colored cardstock with a single Boston phone number scrawled in sharp, aggressive black ink. She was holding a blank check to a criminal empire. Before Nora could process what to do with the small fortune, the flashing red and blue lights of Boston Police Department cruisers painted the frosted windows of her shop. The real world had finally caught up. Nora hurriedly shoved the money clip, the cash and the card into the pocket of her cardigan, just as a heavy knock rattled the front door. "Boston PD, open up!" She smoothed her hair, practiced a look of bleary-eyed confusion, and unlocked the door. 2 officers stood on the snow-covered step, their breath pluming in the air. Behind them, yellow crime scene tape was already being strung across the intersection of Hanover and Cross Street. "Miss, are you the owner of this establishment?" asked the lead officer, a grizzled man whose name tag read Detective Thomas Sullivan. His sharp eyes immediately scanned the interior of the shop, lingering on the dust, the shadows, and finally, Nora. "Yes, I'm Nora Caldwell," she said, wrapping her arms around herself to hide the trembling of her hands. "What's going on? I woke up to a sound like an earthquake." "That's what we're trying to figure out, Miss Caldwell," Sullivan said, stepping inside without being invited. He brought the smell of stale coffee and cheap tobacco with him. "We received dozens of 911 calls regarding an unauthorized blockade of this street, hundreds of unlicensed armored vehicles. Witnesses said they congregated right around this block." "I was asleep," Nora lied, her voice remarkably steady. "My radiator is broken. I was buried under 3 blankets in the back room. When I heard the noise and looked out the window, they were already driving away." Sullivan stared at her, his eyes dropping to the faint, rusty smudge on the hardwood floor near the door. Silas's blood. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She had wiped up the worst of it, but in her frantic state, she hadn't mopped the floorboards. "Cut your foot?" Sullivan asked casually, gesturing to the smudge. "Dropped a box of antique Christmas ornaments," Nora replied instantly. "Stepped on a piece of painted glass. It's been a rough morning." Sullivan's partner, a younger man, stepped in. "Detective, dispatch just updated. We've got a massive situation downtown. The Sterling and Baines building in the financial district. Multiple explosions reported in the underground parking garage. SWAT is mobilizing." Sullivan swore under his breath, his attention snapping away from Nora. "Sterling and Baines? That's Corvo's legitimate front." He looked back at Nora, his gaze piercing. "Lock your doors, Miss Caldwell. Boston is about to get very ugly." They left as abruptly as they had arrived. Nora locked the door behind them, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the deadbolt key twice. She ran to the back room and turned on the small, ancient television sitting on her kitchenette counter. WCVB Channel 5 was broadcasting live. The anchor looked genuinely terrified. Breaking news out of the financial district. A massive structural fire and reported gunfire at the headquarters of property management, Giant Sterling and Baines. Witnesses report seeing heavily armed men storming the lobby just after dawn. Unconfirmed reports suggest the CEO, Dante Corvo, was found deceased in his penthouse office. Nora collapsed onto the ruined Chesterfield sofa, uncaring that her hands rested near the dried blood of the man who had orchestrated the carnage on the screen. "If Corvo breathes, I want him suffocated." Silas hadn't been making a threat. He had been issuing an execution order from her living room, and he had paid off her debts by systematically dismantling the corporation that held them. For the next 3 days, Boston held its breath. The news was a relentless stream of gas leaks, corporate restructuring, and sudden disappearances among the city's elite. To the general public, it was a string of bizarre tragedies and white-collar scandals. But Nora knew the truth. It was a hostile takeover, painted in blood and shadow, led by the man with shattered ice eyes. She didn't spend a dime of the money. She hid the platinum clip and the J.P. Morgan card inside a hollowed-out Victorian clock on the top shelf of her storage room. She tried to convince herself that the nightmare was over, that she was just a ghost who had briefly intersected with a demon. She was horribly, fatally wrong. By Thursday afternoon, the historic blizzard had melted into a depressing, grey Boston slush. Caldwell Antiquities remained closed, the out-of-inquiry sign flipped outward. Nora was on her hands and knees in the back room, scrubbing the hardwood floor with a harsh mixture of bleach and hot water, desperately trying to erase the last microscopic traces of Silas Rossi from her life. The bell above the front door jingled. Nora froze, the scrub brush suspended in her hand. She had locked the deadbolt. She was absolutely certain she had locked it. "Shop's closed," she called out, her voice echoing nervously through the maze of display cases. She stood up, wiping her raw hands on her jeans, and stepped through the velvet curtain. 3 men were standing in her shop. They weren't dressed in the immaculate, tailored suits of the Rossi syndicate. These men looked like alley dogs, rough, jagged, and desperate. They wore heavy leather jackets over dark hoodies, and the smell of cheap adrenaline and unwashed desperation rolled off them. The man in the center stepped forward. He had a jagged scar running from his left ear down to his collarbone and a silver tooth that caught the dim light of the shop. Nora recognized him instantly from a late-night crime documentary she had watched years ago. Dominic Vargas, Dante Corvo's chief enforcer, and one of the few men vicious enough to survive the Rossi purge. "You didn't lock the back alley door, sweetheart," Vargas said, his voice a greasy sneer. He picked up a delicate porcelain figurine of a ballerina from a display table, turning it over in his rough hands. "Get out!" Nora demanded, reaching beneath the counter where she kept a heavy, cast-iron bookend. "I'm calling the police." "The cops are busy pulling my boss's teeth out of the drywall at Sterling and Baines," Vargas snapped, suddenly throwing the porcelain ballerina against the brick wall. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. Nora flinched, stepping back. "We know he was here," Vargas growled, closing the distance between them. His 2 thugs fanned out, deliberately knocking over a stack of first-edition Hemingway novels and kicking a silver tray across the floor. "Rossi, the snowplow driver saw the Armada parked outside this specific address, and the BPD scanner reported blood on your floor. You patched up the devil, little girl." "I don't know what you're talking about," Nora lied, her hand closing around the cold iron of the bookend. A man collapsed outside. He left before dawn. I never even got his name. Vargas laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He lunged across the counter with terrifying speed, his large hand wrapping around Nora's throat. He hoisted her onto her toes, knocking over the vintage brass cash register, which crashed to the floor in a shower of loose coins. "Don't lie to me!" Vargas spat, his spit hitting her cheek. He squeezed her throat, cutting off her airway. "Silas Rossi's uncle is paying $10 million for his head. Rossi took out Corvo, but he missed the uncle's faction. We know he left something with you. A ledger, a burner phone. Give it up, or I'll break every bone in your body and burn this antique trash heap to the ground." Nora gasped for air, her vision spotting with black stars. She swung the heavy iron bookend wildly, catching Vargas hard on the temple. Vargas roared in pain, dropping her. Nora collapsed behind the counter, coughing violently, gasping for the dusty air. Blood trickled down the side of Vargas's face. His eyes went dead with murderous intent. "Tear the place apart!" Vargas commanded his men, pulling a switchblade from his jacket. "And bring her to the back. We're going to have a long conversation." The two thugs advanced on the counter. Nora scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the scattered coins. This was it. She was going to die among her grandfather's forgotten treasures. Suddenly, the front windows of the shop exploded inward. It wasn't a brick, and it wasn't the wind. It was the synchronized concussive force of two flashbang grenades shattering the reinforced glass. A blinding, magnesium-white light erupted in the center of the shop, accompanied by a deafening roar that physically knocked Nora flat against the floorboards. The shockwave shattered every remaining display case, raining glass down like a deadly winter storm. Before the ringing in Nora's ears could even peak, shadows moved through the smoke and broken glass with lethal, terrifying precision. Fut, fut, fut. The suppressed mechanical cough of silenced weaponry echoed in the ruined shop. Nora covered her head, screaming, unable to hear her own voice over the ringing. She felt a heavy body crash onto the floor near her, followed by a wet, gurgling sound. Strong hands suddenly grabbed her arms, hauling her upright. She thrashed wildly, fighting blindly in the smoke. "Nora, stop! Look at me!" The voice cut through the chaos, deep, resonant, and undeniably commanding. Nora blinked rapidly, her vision clearing as the acrid smoke began to drift out through the shattered storefront. Standing in front of her, dressed in a bespoke black suit, a charcoal overcoat draped over his shoulders, was Silas Rossi. He looked entirely different from the shivering, bleeding man she had saved. He radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying power. Behind him, Carlo and 4 heavily armed men in tactical gear were securing the room. Dominic Vargas was on his knees in the center of the shop, bleeding profusely from a gunshot wound to his kneecap. His 2 thugs lay dead among the ruined antiques. Silas's ice-blue eyes scanned Nora's face, zeroing in on the angry, red bruising blooming on her throat where Vargas had choked her. A muscle ticked violently in his jaw. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He slowly let go of Nora and walked toward Vargas. The silence in the shop was absolute, save for the crunch of broken glass beneath Silas's Italian leather shoes. "I told my men to suffocate Corvo," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I assumed his stray dogs would have the sense to run out of the city." "Go to hell, Rossi," Vargas spat, clutching his shattered knee. "Your uncle is going to gut you." "My uncle is currently chained to a radiator in a warehouse in South Boston," Silas replied smoothly. "He is spending his final hours reconsidering his loyalties. And you?" Silas looked down at Vargas with the detachment of a man squashing an insect. "You touched what is mine." Silas didn't pull a weapon. He simply gave a microscopic nod to Carlo. Carlo stepped forward, raised his suppressed pistol, and fired once. Nora flinched violently, letting out a choked sob as Vargas collapsed to the floor, lifeless. "Get her out of here," Silas commanded, turning his back on the carnage. He walked back to Nora, his expression softening only a fraction as he looked at her trembling form. He took off his heavy charcoal overcoat and draped it over her shoulders. The coat smelled of expensive cologne, gun oil, and winter air. It was overwhelmingly warm. "My shop," Nora whispered, looking around at the absolute devastation. The Victorian clocks were smashed. The Hemingway novels were soaked in blood. Her grandfather's legacy was gone, destroyed in less than 3 minutes of violence. "I will buy you 100 shops," Silas said, his large hands gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look up at him. "But you cannot stay here. They know who you are. They know you helped me. You are a target now." I can't just leave," she stammered, overwhelmed by the sensory overload of the violence, the noise, and his towering presence. "You don't have a choice, Nora," Silas stated softly, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek, a surprisingly gentle gesture from a man who had just ordered an execution. "You saved my life. By the laws of my world, your life belongs to me now, and I protect what belongs to me." He didn't wait for her to argue. Silas slipped an arm around her waist, effortlessly supporting her weight, and guided her out of the ruined antique shop. Outside, Hanover Street was once again blocked, but this time it wasn't 300 cars. It was a surgical strike team of 5 armored black SUVs, their engines idling aggressively in the slush. Silas guided her into the cavernous, leather-scented back seat of the lead vehicle. The doors slammed shut, sealing her inside the armored cocoon. As the convoy accelerated away from the north end, leaving her broken life behind, Nora realized with a chilling certainty that the shivering stranger hadn't just brought a war to her doorstep. He had pulled her directly into the center of it. The convoy did not stop until it passed through the heavily fortified wrought-iron gates of a sprawling estate in western Massachusetts. The property was a fortress of glass, steel, and gray stone, hidden from the public eye by acres of dense, snow-covered pine trees. Security cameras tracked their every move, and men armed with matte black assault rifles patrolled the perimeter with chilling regularity. Nora was ushered inside by Silas, who immediately handed her off to a terrifyingly efficient housekeeper named Mrs. Gable. She was led to a master suite that was larger than her entire shop, featuring a massive marble-soaking tub, a walk-in closet already stocked with designer clothing in her exact size, and a balcony overlooking the frozen Charles River. It was a beautiful, opulent cage. For 2 days, Nora barely saw Silas. He was a ghost in his own home, locked in the estate's war room with his lieutenants, orchestrating the systematic dismantling of his enemies. News reports trickled in on the flat-screen TV in Nora's room. A sudden fire at a warehouse in South Boston, a catastrophic industrial accident at the Chelsea docks, the disappearance of 2 prominent city councilmen. Silas was burning his uncle's faction to the ground. But beneath the sterile, controlled environment of the Western estate, a different kind of rot was festering. On her 3rd night in the house, unable to sleep, Nora wandered down to the massive chef's kitchen for a glass of water. The house was dead quiet, the security detail relegated to the perimeter. As she passed the shadowed alcove of the formal library, the murmur of a hushed, frantic voice made her freeze. She pressed her back against the cool plaster of the hallway, holding her breath. The heavy mahogany door of the library was cracked open just an inch. "I told you, Lorenzo, the boy is moving too fast." It was Carlo, the silver-haired loyalist, the man who had knelt in the snow for Silas, was speaking into a burner phone. "He took out Vargas. He has the port authorities completely locked down. If you don't strike tomorrow, you won't have an empire left to steal." Nora's blood ran cold. Lorenzo, Silas's uncle, the man who had ordered the hit that brought a bleeding Silas to her doorstep. "Tomorrow at 8 a.m., Carlo continued, his voice tight with anxiety. "He's personally inspecting the shipment at Pier 4. I've reassigned his primary security detail to the downtown properties. He'll only have 4 men with him. It's your only window. You take him out, and I assume control of the family trust at Cayman National Bank, as we agreed." A pause. "Yes, I'll make sure the girl is dealt with afterward. She's a loose end." Nora didn't wait to hear another word. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in her mouth. She slipped off her slippers, moving with silent, desperate speed back up the grand staircase. She didn't go to her room. She went straight to the east wing, to the heavy oak doors of Silas's private study. The 2 guards stationed outside crossed their arms, blocking her path. "I need to see him," Nora demanded, her voice shaking but fierce. Now. It's a matter of life and death." The guards exchanged a look, but before they could speak, the door clicked open. Silas stood in the doorway, his collar undone, a crystal glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked exhausted, the shadows beneath his ice-blue eyes stark against his pale skin. "Let her in," he murmured. Nora stepped into the dimly lit room, waiting for the heavy door to click shut behind her. The moment they were alone, the words spilled out of her in a frantic rush. She told him everything: the cracked door, the burner phone, Pier 4, the Cayman accounts, and Carlo's betrayal. She expected rage. She expected Silas to draw his weapon and storm downstairs to execute the traitor. Instead, Silas simply walked over to his massive mahogany desk, set his glass down, and let out a long, heavy sigh. He braced his hands on the edge of the desk, his head bowed. "I knew," he said softly. Nora stared at him, stunned. You knew he was working for your uncle?" Silas looked up, his eyes reflecting the dim light of the desk lamp like polished obsidian. "In this world, Nora, loyalty is just a matter of timing and leverage. Carlo served my father for 30 years. He despises how I run the syndicate. Too corporate, too quiet. He craves the old, bloody days. I suspected he gave my uncle the convoy route the night I was shot. I just needed him to give me Lorenzo's location." "But he's setting an ambush for you tomorrow morning," Nora protested, stepping closer to the desk. "He's going to kill you." "No," Silas corrected, a lethal, terrifying smile curving his lips. "He's going to try." He reached across the desk and gently cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed over the fading bruise on her neck, his touch burning against her skin. "You took a massive risk coming to me with this, Nora. If Carlo had caught you in the hallway, you'd be dead." "I saved your life once," Nora whispered, looking up into his imposing, beautiful face. "I wasn't about to let someone take it away now." Silas's gaze darkened, shifting from cold calculation to something entirely different. Something possessive, consuming, and raw. "Get some sleep, Nora. By tomorrow afternoon, there will be no one left in Boston to threaten us." The sky over western Massachusetts broke into a brilliant, unforgiving blue the morning of the ambush. Inside the sprawling, limestone fortress of the Rossi estate, the silence was agonizing. Nora Caldwell paced the length of her gilded cage, her bare feet sinking into the thick Persian rugs. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, the exact hour of the meeting at Pier 4. For the next 3 hours, time became a physical weight. The housekeeper, a stoic woman named Mrs. Gable, brought up a silver tray with a porcelain cup of black Lavazza espresso, but Nora couldn't stomach it. She kept the television tuned to a local Boston news channel on mute. At 9:15 a.m., a breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Heavy police presence in Seaport District. Reports of gunfire near Pier 4. Aerial footage from a news chopper showed a chaotic scene of flashing lights and black tactical vans swarming the icy docks near the Boston Harbor Hotel. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She imagined Silas falling on the frozen, salt-stained concrete, his blood mixing with the icy harbor water. At exactly 11:42 a.m., the heavy wrought-iron gates of the estate finally groaned open. Nora flew to the reinforced window. A surgical fleet of 5 armored Cadillac Escalades tore up the circular driveway, their black paint splattered with gray winter slush and road salt. The doors of the lead vehicle swung open before it even came to a complete stop. Silas Rossi stepped out. He was not the immaculate, composed king who had left that morning. His dark, bespoke overcoat was torn at the shoulder, and his knuckles were split and bleeding, wrapped hastily in a white handkerchief. He moved with a heavy, exhausted limp, but his posture remained terrifyingly straight. He looked up, his ice-blue eyes locking onto the window of her suite for a fraction of a second before he disappeared beneath the portico. Nora didn't wait. She bolted out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the grand marble staircase just as the heavy front doors were thrust open. Silas stood in the cavernous foyer, waving off 2 armed guards with a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. The heavy doors clicked shut, leaving them entirely alone in the echoing hall. The air around him smelled sharply of cordite, freezing sea salt and copper. "It is finished," Silas said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper that seemed to scrape against the marble walls. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She descended the final few steps, her eyes scanning his bruised face and torn clothing. "Carlo." "Carlo is resting at the bottom of the Atlantic," Silas replied, his expression hardening into an unreadable mask of cold stone. "He thought he had me cornered. Lorenzo had 4 snipers positioned on the roof of the old commercial fish market, but I knew the layout of the seaport better than they did. My men were waiting in the shipping containers before Carlo's team even arrived. Lorenzo is dead. The mutiny is completely broken." He closed the distance between them, stopping at the base of the stairs. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined coat and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope, sealed with red wax bearing the Rossi crest. He held it out to her. His hand was trembling, just slightly. "What is this?" Nora asked, staring at the envelope as if it were a loaded weapon. "A ghost protocol," Silas said, his voice stripping away its usual absolute authority, revealing a stark, terrifying vulnerability beneath. Inside is a biometric passport with a new identity, a deed to a secluded, fully staffed vineyard in Tuscany, purchased through a blind shell corporation, and a black titanium centurion card linked to a Zurich account holding $25 million of clean, untraceable capital. Nora looked up at his face, her mind spinning. "There is a private Gulf Stream, G65. Waiting on the tarmac at Hanscom Field," Silas continued, his eyes locked onto hers with a desperate intensity. "The pilots are fueled and ready. I promised I would protect you, Nora. You saved my life, and in return, my world destroyed your quiet existence. This is your exit. You take this envelope, you get in the car waiting outside, and you disappear. You will never have to look over your shoulder again. You will be entirely safe. And if I stay," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could weigh them. Silas's chest heaved. He let the envelope slip from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a heavy, definitive thud. "If you stay," he murmured, taking a slow step up the stairs until his towering frame eclipsed the light from the chandelier. "You are choosing the fire. You will be the queen of a violent, unforgiving empire. You will live with security details, bulletproof glass, and the constant shadow of my enemies. But you will have me. Every dark, broken piece of me, unconditionally. And I swear to you, I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone touch a single hair on your head." Nora looked at the man who had bled on her antique shop floor, the ruthless syndicate boss who had commanded an army to avenge her, and the vulnerable man who was offering her an escape he desperately didn't want her to take. She thought of the cold, lonely nights in her failing shop, the crushing weight of her debt, the silence of her old life. She didn't want the silence anymore. She reached out, her fingers grazing the rough, bloody fabric of his coat before sliding up to cup his bruised jaw. "I'm not getting on that plane, Silas." A ragged breath escaped him. Silas wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her entirely off her feet, his iron control finally shattering. His mouth crashed down on hers in a kiss that tasted of sea salt, violence, and absolute devotion. As he carried her up the stairs of the fortress, Nora knew the shivering stranger had not just destroyed her old life, he had given her a kingdom. The blizzard that brought Silas Rossi to Nora Caldwell's doorstep eventually melted, but the cold, beautiful, and dangerous world he dragged her into remained. She had opened her door to a dying stranger and inadvertently crowned the king of Boston's underworld. In the years that followed, Caldwell Antiquities reopened on Newbury Street, a glittering, immaculate fortress masquerading as a high-end boutique. Nora was no longer a struggling shopkeeper, drowning in debt. She was the untouchable matriarch of the Rossi Syndicate. Their love story was not born of romance, but forged in blood, gunpowder, and a desperate winter night. They were two halves of a violent coin, he the ruthless sword that carved out their empire, and she the quiet, observing shield that protected his back. Nora learned that when you let a monster in from the cold, you don't tame him. You simply learn to rule the dark together.